So, welcome to this episode of the Rule Breakers podcast. I'm delighted to say that my guest today is the one and only Jon Udell. You're very, very welcome, Jon, and I love your background of musical equipment, which is also a shared passion of mine. How are you doing, Jon?
Doing well, thank you.
So, I owe you a great debt of gratitude. Essentially, some of the work that you did with Byte magazine and and then later on, I guess, with InfoWorld, um, was very instrumental in my own career trajectory because you wrote an. I'm going back to the late '80s here now. I remember reading articles about SGML, which I had worked a little bit with while I was in university. Um, but it was a little bit later on into the 2000s when I was an avid reader of Byte magazine, but I distinctly remember at some stage you wrote an article about, I believe it was SGML, using SGML for CD-ROM based publishing. It was but I believe it was Byte magazine. It's a long, long time ago, but it
It would have
triggered.
been, what we did for the CD of Byte magazine is we repurposed the web content that I had been working on,
Right,
and
right,
that wasn't SGML at all. It was just essentially semantic HTML.
right. I
But
think
I mean, yeah,
I
yeah.
think the article that I'm thinking of, I think predates that. I think it was where you were just talking about back in those days. It had started to dawn on folks that if you had a lot of material and you wanted to publish it in a CD-ROM, like a Microsoft Encarta, to pick an example from that
Uh,
era, that having your content in HTML made it possible to automate a lot of the electronic publishing things. Um, But anyway, that was part of it. And then at some point, somewhere in your publications, I think it was you who coined the phrase "the document is the database." So I think that was you.
I certainly took that up and amplified it. I'm
Okay.
sure it wasn't original to me, but that's always been a key theme for me. Was
Right.
documents are data. Data is,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, and that was a huge inflection point in my own career because at the time I was struggling, but I had a data set that I wanted to publish on 3.25 inch floppy disks, sorry, 3.5 inch floppy disks. And the data was semi-structured, and so there were fields in it, you know, um, and it was to do with third level education. So it had a field for the title of the course, it had a field for the duration of the course, but then it broke into a whole bunch of narrative text, and back in those days, it wasn't at all obvious how you would deal with that kind of information. And I remember when it dawned on me that that's where uh, SGML could really play an important role. So this was prior to the whole World Wide Web thing happening, um, and it was sort of a light bulb moment for me that like semi-structured information uh, can actually be processed as if it's a database, even though it doesn't fit into the traditional concepts that led to, you know, third normal form and SQL and, all
Yeah.
of the old relational database type thing. So yeah, that's all the way back to the 1980s. So that's where I was an avid reader of Byte magazine. Um, in the modern era, I think there's no equivalent. But that idea of just you want once a month, going into the book, the news shop, and coming out with a bright, shiny new copy of Byte magazine and grabbing a cup of coffee and leafing through all of the pages and reading your stuff and Jerry Pournell's articles and all of that, all the good stuff, and reading all the adverts for various things I didn't understand as a newbie in the whole IT world was really, really uh, was very formative, for me in my early years. So thank you very
It
much
was
for all of
a
that.
it was a great privilege being there, and honestly, I mean, the world came to us. It was
Right.
extraordinary. On any given day, in a little town in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is a town of a couple thousand and not near anything. And
Mm.
every single day, somebody would have flown from Silicon Valley to come and show us their their new thing and hoped that we would write about it. It was an embarrassment of riches.
And how did you end up joining Byte magazine or getting involved with that publication?
I well, like a lot of, or like some folks in our world, I began as an English major,
Okay.
interested in literature and philosophy, and got to the end of my undergrad without having really ever touched a computer, and suddenly realizing that I didn't think my future was going to be being an English professor.
Okay.
And I just landed in a job at the university where they were doing publishing of the university course catalog and related stuff. And it was, I guess, very early days for electronic publishing, what we then, called electronic publishing.
Right.
And so they had a system that was written in a language called Snowball, which I think almost no one will have heard of or certainly won't remember, but it was a string processing language. And that was the thing that we encoded our stuff in and then published to what was, I think, one of the first laser printers. Um,
Right.
and so, yeah, I mean, that was my introduction to, it was a weird introduction to software and programming. And, it's like regexes were core to Snowball. And
Right.
I think that was probably, maybe that was the thing that really got me in understanding how you could handle documents like data, right? Was that, you've got this pattern matching that you can do, um,
Right.
and a lot of things fall out of that.
Right. Indeed. Yeah. I remember Snowball. I don't remember ever attempting to write any code in it, but I certainly remember the name. Um, I guess the first encounter I had with them was on an AT&T System 5 Unix machine. Um, oh no, it was a PDP-11 from Digital Equipment Corporation. I remember first encountering the command grep and being able to use regular expressions to match things on the command
And they,
line.
mhm.
Yeah, that was kind of an aha moment for me also about how you could extract that text didn't need to just be a blob of stuff in a file that you can't do anything with
Yep.
other than look at. Um, and you stayed at Byte for what, it was about a decade or so you were at Byte?
Yeah, I mean, I'd still be there, right? If it was still happening. But yeah, I got there for the last 10 years. And so in a way, I kind of missed the glory days of, the early era, but
Right.
it was great experience.
And I had a quick look just to remind myself just before this call. Gosh, you've done an awful lot of things in your career today. This is jumping around a little bit, so this is not in chronological order. But I mean, one of the things that you were involved with that's always interested me is the work that you did with is it hypothesis? How do you
Yeah,
pronounce it?
hypothesis. Yeah.
Which obviously is directly related to what in the markup world I guess started out as high time, the high time standard, which
Yep.
was for representing linking. How do you link this thing to that thing, and how do you overlay annotations to this thing, without making changes to it and so on. Um,
Yeah.
we're all baked into high time. Um, so how did that come about? The work with hypothesis.
I moved out to the West Coast a little over 10 years ago, and
Mm,
just, that was the first thing I landed on, and it really spoke to deep interests of mine, in particular the idea that what you were doing was making the whole web not just document addressable, but you
right,
know granularly addressable, um,
right,
in smaller, more focused ways.
right, right,
To
right,
that, I mean, the model is a beautiful thing because hypothesis is focused on annotation of text, and so you're looking for anchoring things to little islands of structure in documents. But we participated in W3C standardization for
Mhm.
annotation, and the selectors at the core of it can describe anything. I mean, you can have selectors that describe molecular shapes, or
Right,
regions in space. I mean, it's completely open ended, and I think that's fascinating, right? I mean, so the fact that the web was just a document addressable is
Right.
itself, this thing that continues to um, surprise us in
Right.
terms of how powerful it is. But
Right.
then the notion that every one of those addressable documents has an infinite number of addressable locations within it that
Right.
are, shareable, and it's a big idea.
Indeed. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and what springs to mind as you talk about that, as you talk about it that way, is work I remember reading by Doug Engelbart,
Mhm.
Purple Text,
Yep.
which I think was that
Purple numbers. Yeah.
purple numbers, right? That idea
Yes.
at least gets you down to paragraph level.
Yep.
But I think this, this whole idea of addressability is, directly connected to what people intuitively mean when they say structured content. There's people will disagree about exactly how you go about structuring content, but I've always thought is that if there's some way of basically of expressing how you pull out a paragraph or how you pull out, an individual section of a blob of text,
Hmm.
if it is addressable, then it's structured, right? Because that's mostly what we want to do is we want to be able to get at its component pieces.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
that's been one of the things I've worked on a lot because this bookshelf behind me, this virtual bookshelf behind me is, I spent a lot of time working with legal texts, and legal texts are incredibly densely interconnected, and they also quote each other left, right, and center.
Hmm.
And there's a bigger volume of annotations to law than there is law.
Right.
Um, and of course, the law keeps changing, which means you've got knock-on effects into the annotations. And so it's a fascinating problem in the same kind of space that hypothesis is in.
But what is the status of annotation in the world of legal material? I mean, do people routinely use links that cite locations within documents, and do the tools then know to go and, and reach into those anchors?
Yeah, so it's I suppose there's a couple of aspects to it. The first is the lawyers have been coming at this problem for centuries, so their approaches to dealing with it, predate computers.
Right.
So to this day, for a lot of legal material, the primary method of citation continues to be page number. So for case law, for example,
Mm.
um, which is what a lot of lawyers in practice are really interested in, because that's the material that tells you what the law means,
Mhm.
as and how it's being interpreted in the courts, which is all important. Um, yeah, the primary citation continues to be the page number. There have been initiatives over the years from Cornell University and some other places to come up with what Cornell folks refer to as a media neutral citation,
Mhm.
which would be a very useful thing. But the world of law changes slowly. So,
Right. So
it,
those page numbers are just then relative to editions of,
and that's where
right?
things get, then you bring up another interesting technology that most folks have forgotten about that's still really, really important in my world, which is loose leaf publishing. Because in the world of loose leaf publishing, um, if content is baked onto page 1, 2, 3, 4, and you need to put in some new content between the old 1, 2, 3, 4 and the new and the old 1, 2, 3, 5, you do it with a 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.1 page.
Yeah, right.
So so you could see how in your hypothesis example there, like your selectors, right, would allow you to pick out those so-called point pages.
Mhm.
And it's all done because the page numbers are all important. You have to be
Mhm.
able to refer to it today, knowing that you can go, refer to it in six, like say American tax law, for example,
Right.
and go back to it, in 10 years' time and know that the stuff that you read from the courts is still correct, that the page numbers.
It occurs to me that in earlier days, we might have looked at that and thought, oh, well, how silly is that when they could
Right.
just have URL. And now I'm kind of feeling that that page number citation is way more stable than anything that's on the
Right.
web.
No, indeed. No,
We haven't done a
absolutely.
great job about keeping URLs stable, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, is 404 a bug or a feature? But certainly in the world of law, it has become a bug, yeah, an issue which, still hasn't been solved. I saw a statistic somewhere, I think something like, I don't know, 20% of existing um, Supreme Court opinions have some degree of bit rot. In other words, the citations no longer work.
That's all.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, but I mean that's a that's not a high percentage.
No, 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 indeed, indeed, indeed.
Like for the web at large, it's like most of it, right?
Right, right, right. And I've even noticed myself that, stuff that I wrote in, articles that I wrote in, IT world, back in the early 2000s or whatever, are starting to fall off the other end of the web. They're
Well, I
no
mean,
longer around.
most of my output is only uh, captured because I captured it and moved it someplace. I mean, yeah, the ephemerality of our stuff on the web is it used to really depress me, and now I don't think about it too much. So much depends on the Internet Archive, which I mean, for that tiny organization to be carrying the load that it is crazy.
Yeah, it would be nice to see that get shored up at some stage for sure. Um, but I guess various initiatives have come and gone. It seems there was one called Perm ID, which I think might have also come from one of the law schools that was attempting to create a kind of a permanent identifiers. Um, we've had a go at it, in our world to create permanent point in time identifiers so that you can get back to what a piece of content looked like, at a previous point in time.
Yep.
But I think ultimately because you can never own a web address, you can only rent it. Uh, you know, we're always on shifting sand as a consequence of that.
Well, that's part of it, and for me, having worked for publications, the bigger part of it is that those businesses are so ephemeral, and once they go away, whatever structure they were maintaining just collapses, right?
Right,
There's nothing holding it up. So, I mean, that's the biggest thing, really. It's like
right, indeed.
it turns out that getting published on the web is a terrible way to stay published.
And what do you think about the evolving? It seems every few years now there's kind of a new sort of way of being online. I mean, I remember when, blogging was the big thing. Everyone had a blog, including me. Um, and now there's things like Substack and various things like that. It seems as if there's that's still shifting sands, right? We haven't found a good way. It seems to me of or consensus around a good way of having a long-lived record of your work on online. It seems to be kind of
I
an
mean, we know how to do it, which is
right,
those of us who are willing and able to maintain our own properties on the web.
right,
Um, not rely on platforms to do it for us. But
right,
that's extra effort. It's not. I mean, I understand why that's not something that's easy or accessible to most people, and I'm sad about that. But
right.
that's the reality. Like we know how, it's just too hard.
And one of the things that intrigues me about the various different things that you've done over the years is I kind of juxtapose in my head the hypothesis stuff, which immediately, in my mind, speaks to the kind of, the document world, the problem of citation, the problem of permanence, all of those things. But then you also spent time working on the SQL side of things, the kind of the structured content side of things with SteamPipe. Isn't that right?
Yeah, SteamPipe took me on a deep excursion into SQL, which I hadn't touched in a really long time.
Right.
And now it's become kind of central to how I think about things. And I just also love it that it's been around for what is it, 50 years now, and it's gaining traction, right? I mean, in the world of enterprise data, whatever else is happening behind the scenes, there's a SQL layer on top of it, right? It is really the great unifier for, and in recent years, not just kind of conventional rows and columns, right? But
Indeed.
the structured or semi-structured capabilities that are in Postgres
Postgres, yeah.
are were an eye opener. I don't know if you've looked at DuckDB, but it's an extraordinary thing also. So yeah, like SQL is not only not going away, right? SQL is in my opinion gaining strength and power.
We've seen the same trend. When you look at the kinds of things that you can do with Postgres and GraphQL, it's just extraordinary to trace all of that back to the original rows and columns where you had 4 or 5 different data types, dollar amounts, dates, 20 character fields, and so on. And it's certainly come a long way. And because it's baked into, I guess, it's baked into the offerings from the big cloud providers. I guess it's like it's just there. I think that's got a bunch to do with it as well. But it's some other things that have changed, over the years in the document space that have kind of surprised me a little bit is I've always drawn in my own mind an analogy between the problem of writing, say, a novel, or the problem of writing a book of law, and the problem of managing a repository of source code, because they're both structured or semi-structured textual things, typically consisting of lots and lots and lots of things that are connected to each other, tens of thousands of pieces of information. So I've always avidly tracked what the software developers are doing in the technologies that they build for themselves to manage their own source code, to steal ideas for ways of possibly managing things that are not obviously source code. So
it's a fascinating thing. I mean, those of us who have been thinking about structured documents for the longest time have a tendency to look at, well, the way that source code management works, which is still to this day line oriented.
right?
So like your diffs in Git are about lines, and there's no knowledge of the fact that that line is part of a function, and that function is an object, and
right.
And so we well, I have friends who are more virulent about this than me. I've kind of given up being sad or upset about it, but like we don't really have structured editors and writing tools that comprehend structure that then relate to the underlying systems, which are still unstructured, very much like like line by line by line, right? It's like it's a line editor still,
right?
But yeah, I understand why, right? That makes sense, right? Because that is the most universal and interoperable way of doing it.
I have seen some of the AI, the LLMs do pretty impressive things with the taking IDEs to a whole new level in terms of their ability to predict what you might want to do next in this particular piece of Python code that you're writing, because
this has been a huge surprise to me, and I've come to think about it less in terms of next word or next token prediction, although I know that's the engine of it under the covers. But in practice, what it feels very much like to me is that, I mean, kind of going back to Snowball and regexes, like what was at the core of that really was what I would now call pattern recognition.
Right.
And I see LLMs as just incredibly powerful and universal pattern recognizers.
Right.
So for example, at one point I put a lot of energy into calendar syndication. I had the idea that we all have these web calendars like Google Calendar and other things, and they actually have structure available, via the ICS export that you can do, or just Google Calendar just gives you an ICS. So your calendar has this structured counterpart, and we can syndicate and merge all this stuff together. And it mostly still isn't happening. If you try to say like what's happening in my city today, you still have to go to 18 different places because we haven't successfully, syndicated and consolidated that information. But anyway, when I was working on this, I spent a long time trying to convince people that they needed to publish in structured formats. That it was like no good to just like, it was fine to have a picture of your event poster, the same one that you stuck on the telephone pole, for people to see walking around. It was fine to put that picture on the website, but that picture was not structured data that could participate in a syndication flow. And
Right.
right. So it's like, no, 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 you can't do it that way. You have to do it this way, right? And nobody wanted to, because it's always extra effort to materialize the structured representation of something. Well, then, a couple years ago, I was just amazed to see that the boundary between uh, images of text and text had just dissolved, right? And I mean, there came a day when I could point my phone at a poster for an event on a telephone pole and have the information extracted, have it synthesized as iCalendar, and have it into my calendar on my phone. And that's, you know, um, it's amazing.
It sure is. Uh, yeah, no, of all of the things that I've seen, since I first got my Chat GPT account, whenever that was, all of the amazing stuff that I've seen, the stuff that's blown me away has been the vision stuff, the vision language models. I don't understand the mathematics, right? And I'm not deep in machine learning, but I know enough to be able to. I think I've got a reasonable, high level conceptual idea of what it's doing with its vector space and the token prediction and attention and all of those good things. Um, but some of the things that Nano Banana does, I have no model for. So I could take a screenshot, of what I'm looking at here now in your room, and I could ask it to put a teddy bear, to the left of the capo. And it somehow would know where the capo was, and to be able to put a teddy bear, to the left of it, and to put the appropriate shadow, on the wall behind it. And I've no explanation for how that works. It just amazes me.
Right. Well, I'm deeply conflicted about this stuff. I mean, I absolutely understand and appreciate all of the many downsides and uh, uh, social injustices and environmental catastrophes and everything else, right? I mean, this is not an unadulterated benefit in any way,
Right.
and so I'm very much aware of all of that, right? And I know people who, on principle, just reject and avoid this stuff, and I respect that, but for me, I haven't been able to avoid it just because I, I can't help but explore what becomes possible. And
Right.
on the vision front, to me, um, the most interesting thing in the realm of software is how difficult it has become for people to deal with web user interfaces, which are constantly changing. Like you even said at the beginning of this call, like where did Zoom put the button today?
Right.
And
Right. Right.
what happens in here and there. And I'm now just constantly, as I encounter these frustrations, just showing screenshots to these AIs, who can then correlate them to the documentation and to, oh, but the documentation is out of date, and actually someone said that this is now here and this does this that differently. So learning and using software is a very visual kind of experience in a world of
Right.
GUIs, right? And we,
Right. Right.
hey, right? Like I always thought it should be the case that we should expose more of our software to URLs,
Right.
because then documentation wouldn't have to say, find the thing that looks like this, click it, and then when that happens, find the thing that looks like, and we have all of these sort of, procedural explanations for things that could just be links
Right. Right. Right.
in the documentation, right? But we kind of haven't gotten that. But what we have got is this ability to look at the thing and, understand where's the thing to click and what happens next, and what is the context around that when you get there. Does that differ from what we expected? It's
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just completely remarkable. One of the things it's also caused me to have to reevaluate in my own brain is, typically when we be working, when are working on a project to do with content, like typically large volumes of content is what we deal with. So, millions of pages of stuff. Um, and typically there are back catalogs involved, so, oh, we've been doing this kind of work for the last 20 years. You know, we've got 20 years worth of history on a collection of DVDs somewhere. And then, what's the format of choice for a lot of that stuff? Well, it's PDFs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, PDF covers a multitude, ranging from, very structured PDFs because they have been exported from something, that just
Right.
automatically downloaded the PDF.
Or in digital versus not. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get, go back in time and you'll find the scanned PDF, which is, 30 degrees off the vertical, and has been scribbled on at the top with some really important information with a pen.
Yeah.
And it's all PDF. But I remember thinking, as I was watching some of the results that folks were getting, extracting information from those PDFs, with the likes of Gemini, for example, thinking to myself, I never thought the day would come when I would say, but that the ideal format now for a large corpus of information is PDF, because it will be PDF from end to end. And if the PDFs are complicated and there's multi-column layouts and your portrait and landscape and you've got, images, in the middle that span 2 columns, etc., you're going to need a vision capability in order to make sense of that stuff anyway. But I honestly never thought it would happen in my lifetime, that it would become actually feasible to even think about asking a computer to figure out the flow order of the text from all of that complex.
I mean, it's still the wrong thing, right? I mean, obviously what we really would prefer is its rational structure inside, not something that's been created to emulate a particular page format.
Right.
And well, you may know Peter Murray Rust. He's a guy who's spent a huge amount of effort trying to crack PDFs. In particular, a problem that he has focused on. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but was in scientific literature trying to extract and understand tables.
Right.
Because tables in scientific literature aren't like, just rows and columns, right? They are expressing, different kinds of things in a lot of ways. And, actually, you should try as well. I sometimes try just grabbing a couple of, scientific papers from archive and throwing them at an LLM. They're still not all the way there.
Right.
But you can clearly get farther with them than running, a PDF cracker.
Absolutely.
Tool. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that has given me pause over my career, and thinking about the whole structured document versus the, WYSIWYG, the Microsoft Word, approach, is that there comes a point in information, and it manifests most acutely in things like tables, where the layout of the information and the meaning of that information are very deeply intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
You make a small sense to the layout, and you've changed the interpretation.
Yeah.
Certainly in my world of heavily regulated industries and so on, anything like that immediately sets off the alarm bells in my head, because you're potentially changing the meaning of a thing simply by reflowing the text or reformatting the table and so on. And I've never come to a satisfactory answer to that. I think Peter Murray Rust, did he do work with chemical formulas as well? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that stuff, that's the layout aspect of that's just very important to the meaning of it. It's quite difficult to the classic XML mantra was always thou shalt separate content from presentation. But there are some very, very important corner cases where it's not quite that simple.
Right.
Tables and chemical formulas being two classic examples.
Right.
You're one of the few people I know who've danced between those worlds, right? Of all of the stuff that we're talking about here, about document centric, computing, and then the the more relational um, SQL type stuff that we talked about earlier on. Um, do you actually see those two actually, ultimately, at least when it comes to the storage layer, ultimately everything being some variant of an SQL, a 21st century SQL thing? Is that where you think all of the world's content is headed?
Oh, I doubt it. I don't really know. I mean, so the steam pipe thing, since you brought it up,
Yeah.
was um was and is super interesting because what it is about is normalizing APIs. And so, a kind of thing I've done often and still do is uh, pull information from a variety of different sources and synthesize it into
Mm.
some common thing. And when every API is different, and you have to write custom code to talk to this API, which gives this shape of data, and that API, which gives that shape of data, and then kind of merge it procedurally. It's just a lot of work, right? And when, on the other hand, um, you write SQL, which is the normalized way of talking to a whole universe of APIs, and now you're literally doing a SQL join between, something that came from the Google Cloud and something that came from, another source and something that came from a different source, right? But it's
Mm.
just it's a SQL join of three tables. That's incredibly powerful leverage.
Right,
Um,
right.
but that focuses particularly on the world of APIs and unifying
Yeah,
them,
yeah, yeah.
not so
Sure.
much on just like just content in general.
I think you recently on your LinkedIn page, I think you made reference to an interview that you did with Bill Gates at some point where with something like, what was it? It's all about writing less code.
Yeah.
Uh, it's like what you just said about the steam pipe thing. Just, in my head, I'm counting all the lines of code I wouldn't have to write if I could just write uh, the SQL expression for for steam pipe that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, was that a long time ago that you talked to Mr. Gates?
Yeah, I think that would have been when I was at InfoWorld. It was in one of the Microsoft professional developer conferences.
Right.
It just is funny because we talked about a lot of different things, but for some reason that stuck in my head. And now, I mean, that's a huge focus for XML UI, which is the thing I'm working on now. Which is, how can you build useful web-based or software based on the web platform, without writing a whole lot of React code and without writing a whole lot of CSS, right? How can you do it in a much more concise and declarative way?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, but it just intrigues me that, another thing I remember Bill Gates talking about was, lines of code, right? The old SOLOC metric. And as blunt an instrument as it is, it is still it is still so useful, that every line of code is essentially a cost that you're going to, with a total cost of ownership. And
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
really blunt way to measure your costs, but
Yeah, as long as
it's
you don't think
surprisingly
that the
effective.
larger number is better, right?
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah,
Which a
yeah,
lot of people
yeah.
do. They know
Absolutely.
large numbers are not your friend.
Yeah, absolutely. I always had an uneasy relationship with Microsoft Visual Studio and the concept of the wizards, where you could say, I want to develop a Microsoft Windows DLL, and essentially it would pump out all of the boilerplate code
Hmm.
for you. Um, Always felt a bit uneasy about that because I knew it was going to be up to me to maintain that code afterwards. And if something went wrong, but I had relied on a Shazam button to generate all of that,
Hmm.
where was that going to leave me? I do
Yeah, I
worry.
mean, if it was like a dozen lines of code that you could look at and understand at a glance, that'd be one thing, right? But it
Right,
has generated, 18 files and thousands of lines of stuff. It's like, oh my
right.
God.
And I guess now that looks trivial in comparison to what you can do now, where you can basically conjure up, a single page web application using the React framework by talking to an LLM, and it just spits out reams and reams and reams of stuff. And if best of luck maintaining that.
Well,
Um,
this is exactly the question that we'll find out.
Yeah.
And I don't know how this is going to land, but a huge argument that I am making for XML UI is that, yeah, you can go have Claude write you your invoice app and it'll generate, thousands of lines of React that you are not competent to review or maintain, possibly, and
Mhm.
thousands of lines of CSS that you're not competent to review or maintain, and it'll appear to work, right? And, maybe you can ask it to make the change that you wanted and that will appear to work too. But you're completely dependent on the AI to be your intermediary there, right? You have no
Right.
ability, and maybe the world will just decide that that's okay,
Yeah.
but for some people, it won't be now. And for some people, it might not be ever. And so if you want to be in control, um, well, what if you could express that same thing in, 1/100th the number of lines of code,
Right.
right? And then, you can still have the AI actually work with you to generate that much smaller amount of code. But now what it
Right.
generates is something you can read and understand
Right.
and push back on and review and modify and in fact actually collaborate with. So
Right.
I've done this experiment, right? I mean, I have a to-do application that is exactly what you just described, right? I just was talking to the AI. It wrote me the thing. I'm actually using it. It's fine, but but I can't understand, all of what it's doing. And if I can get a much more concise representation that is functionally equivalent that I can work with, right?
Hmm.
That, now I'm collaborating with the LLM as opposed to just, depending on it, right?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so I don't know. I mean, that I think that should matter. A lot of things that I think should matter don't matter. Whether this one will turn out to matter or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
I have heard the phrase vibe coding cleanup. Uh, a bit like, supermarkets, vibe coding cleanup on aisle 4. And,
Yeah.
there are folks who find that they can now do this, and do it and are amazed, but get themselves into a world of hurt,
Yep.
afterwards. And then software engineering
Yeah.
folks to understand what's really happening behind the scenes, then have to come in and do the cleanup and try and one of the things I really I thought was just so cool when I first saw my first web browser. I think it was Cello or Mosaic or one of those. Um, but I remember seeing the view source button and thinking, "Oh, how cool is that?" You
Yep.
know, because it was, I could immediately see that that was the important thing, and I could work with that. I could understand how it worked. I could edit it. Right, it was human readable. Uh,
Yep. Yep.
all
Try
of,
view source now, right? You're
oh,
looking at
yeah,
a
exactly.
pile of unminified, or minified, React code. Good luck with that, right?
Yeah, yeah, 36K worth of JavaScript and essentially an empty HTML wrapper. Yeah. Uh, but what I've been doing in my own little experiments with some of this vibe coding thing, because to your point about I'm drawn to things that are now possible, right? Even though you've got all of those other issues about copyright concerns on one hand and environmental concerns on the other, and so on. The fact that it's even possible is just intriguing. Um, but what I did was I developed I've now got a suite of these little one page, single page web applications for little productivity things that I do myself.
Mhm.
Um, but what I've started to do is in the vibe coding instructions to create these things, I've asked it to include a view source menu item,
Mhm.
and
I do the same. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, to include the prompt that would allow me to regenerate the app, uh, with mixed results. But something like that, a pattern like that, I think would be incredibly powerful. Where uh, uh, because then essentially you're treating the app as more of a throwaway artifact. Who knows what the AIs are going to be capable of in 2 years' time? But if you've got a reasonably structured prompt that led to the creation of that app, then maybe that's your source code. Not the 36K of React JavaScript.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, it can be, and as long as you have a way of validating and
right.
verifying the correctness, and some things. some things are easy to validate and verify, some things are hard or impossible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a key distinction, right? Like,
Oh,
at the end of the
absolutely.
day, if you can, with any software, right, all we can say about it ultimately is it passes the tests or doesn't. Can we make this stuff testable?
Right.
One of
Indeed.
the really interesting things that has come out of my recent work is the idea that that software documentation can now be a testable discipline. And so what I mean by that is that if you've run into this model context protocol idea,
Indeed. Yeah.
um, yeah. So for someone who's learning XML UI, we have now this MCP server, and it has access to both the source code and the documentation. And so when you're working with one of these agents, the idea is that, how do I paginate a list, right? And it should come back with a known working example of how to do that. Or it should say, I didn't find a known working example, so I think it might be this, but I'm not sure, right? I actually have a huge um, challenge in getting them to reliably admit that they don't know,
Oh, indeed. Indeed. Yeah.
because they don't want to admit
Right.
that, right? And so,
Right.
like, no matter how I prepare the base prompts, they're still liable to just go off and make stuff up. But the idea is that I'm working with it, and either I get a URL that points into the documentation for how to
Hmm.
do that thing, or I don't, right? But then if I don't get that, um, it's a bug in the documentation. Like, we haven't covered that case. We haven't been able to answer that question with a working pattern. Well, I'll go create that working pattern, add it to the
Done.
documentation, go back and ask the same question. And since these things have no memory, right, it's like it's quite possible that now I've fixed that problem. And so it's
Right.
funny. I was talking to a young guy who was thinking about getting into technical writing, and I thought my first reaction was like, well, that's what a boring place to be. Who wants to be there? And now it's like, actually, no, that's a really interesting place to be right now. Is exactly that space, right? Because coordinating with with these AIs is its own kind of discipline, its own kind of art
Sure.
form, I guess.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think we're definitely going to see, not just, not just a new sort of role for folks like the AI person. I think there's going to be a whole plethora of new uh, job descriptions to do with all of this stuff. Because one of the big ones that we see is there's this equation, right, which is, you get an AI to do something and it's amazing, and rush of blood to the head. Let's do it this way. Let's push it to production or whatever. um, be it a document or a piece of software or whatever. But because these things are just inherently non-deterministic, and as you say, predisposed to lie to you, um, and that equation needs to be the equation of its ultimate utility needs to be significantly nuanced. It's the value that it seems to give you, and then the value that's left on the table after you've factored in the cost of checking everything that it did, and
Right,
if that
right.
number comes
Which
out to be
yeah, which
negative.
which is just to say that you want to bias in favor of things that are checkable
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
straightforwardly, right? And that's just there are very different classes of problem, and there are some classes of problem that are straightforwardly checkable,
Right,
others that
right,
just are not, right? And yeah,
right.
I don't see people making that distinction as
Right.
crisply as they ought.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big area of the area of the work that we do, um, because checkability and auditability about of content is absolutely key in legal and regulatory content. So where
Right.
essentially you have to be right. Like the bar is either it's 100% correct or it's wrong. That's kind of
Yep.
the bar.
Yep.
So it's very different from, vibe coding a Shakespearean poem or something, which the
Yep.
AIs are amazing at. But yeah, it's in that area of auditability and traceability and checkability. And hopefully, I think what will happen here is my sense is that perhaps the agentic AI thing will ultimately, um, because we're now talking about, little specialist AIs doing things, collaboratively. That good old fashioned rules based AI, which was, for the longest time, the dominant one. I mean, I remember Byte magazine having an article about AI that I'd read back in the day. I can't put a year on this, but that was all about deductive reasoning, rules based AI, and so on. Programming languages like Prolog, but that kind of thing in Prolog, where you can basically you can go back to, you can trace its answer, to find out how it came to that conclusion. That thing that was baked into Prolog will be extremely useful for some of the things I'm working on. So maybe what will happen is that kind of thing will be baked into some sort of concept, like this agent is deterministic, this one is non-deterministic. This one has a built-in ability to explain itself, this one doesn't.
Right.
And that it's
the determinism is ultimately on us. So at the end of the day, you're doing transformations, right? I'm transforming B. And if I really understand B and what B needs to be, then I know that isn't B, or that is B, right? That's on me choosing a problem where I can know that B is actually B.
Right.
Reliably, right? A priori, right? Without.
But the software documentation thing has always intrigued me also, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of watching what goes on in software development as a source of ideas for, how you manage a huge corpus of essentially textual material. But I remember coming across Don Knuth's system. Was it called Tangle and Weave?
Web, Tangle, and Weave. Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Literate programming.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I was blanking on the phrase. Absolutely, yeah, literate programming. And I remember thinking when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this is great. The documentation and the code kind of are one and the same. But at some point it dawned on me that just because the code and the documentation were in the same place, it doesn't mean that the documentation is right. It's not necessarily reflective of what the code does.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real challenge in all of this is that the likelihood that you'll get drift between what the code actually does and what the documentation says.
No, it's an inevitability, and that's why it's we're at the point where you need to be involved in explaining the architecture of a system, documenting what are the subsystems, what are their responsibilities, how do they interact, things like that. But at the kind of granular level, sort of like writing comments in line, I think we're already at the point where you're probably just better off asking for a dynamically generated explanation of what's happening in this chunk of code rather than trying to bake it in.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen some really pretty impressive examples of just pointing an AI at a code base and asking it to generate a wiki, of what's going on in this code. It's
right. At that point, you might as well just have it be, if you reliably get good explanations, and again, like where it can work well is in a domain that is a popular one, right? So if I'm in a popular domain, like this library is something that lots of people use. There's lots of examples out there of using it well and badly. And those are all citable examples, right? Then it's something extracted from code that uses that library is likely to be good,
right?
And and will be checkable, right? But if you're off on the long tail, right? I'm working in an area where there aren't a lot of existing patterns that describe this thing and are citable, right? And but that's just a continuum that you navigate. You understand that if I'm in a well-traveled area, I'm going to be getting good results here. If not, I shouldn't expect the same good results.
It gets deep. I think Ludwig Wittgenstein, was it? It's something like language is use or something, that the more examples you have of people using a word in a particular context, ultimately will trump any kind of dictionary definition of what the word supposedly means. It's like
Right.
the word
Right.
means what the majority of people interpret it to mean is what it means.
Right. Of
So
course, there can also be consensus that is wrong.
true, 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 true.
Right. This is, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like in my lifetime, an example I like to give is in when I was younger, for sure, uh, wireless was a radio, and now the word wireless is much more likely to refer to Wi-Fi.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's a small example of how a language has changed. The meaning of a word has changed over my lifetime. So language does drift in its interpretations. Um, but I'd like to bring you back to the XML UI thing, and excuse my ignorance here when I ask this question, but what is XML UI and X forms in the same ballpark? What's the relationship between those two? The W3C, Stephen Pemberton, X form.
There's no relationship.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
XML UI comes out of an experience that the founder of this project had. So his first business was components for network communication,
Hmm.
and those components uh, lived in the Visual Basic marketplace, right? And so for 30 years he's been in this world where somebody will pick up a tool like Visual Basic. They won't be a deep programmer. They'll be I mean somebody who's IT literate but not doesn't consider themselves to be a coder necessarily, but needs a piece of software um, uh, for their business. And before they could imagine vibe coding it, right? There was, well, I get Visual Basic, and there's this library of components, and I can plug this in, I can plug that in, and kind of wire them together, and end up with a useful thing. And people were doing that in the late '80s and early
Right.
'90s. Right. Visual Basic with eBase and Boxflow, things like that. And so then, when kind of the web platform took over software, we actually kind of lost that ability for the non-expert to be productive,
Right.
because suddenly all of this deep specialization is needed to build applications on the web platform, right? You need somebody who's got a just tremendous amount of deep React experience and CSS. Those things are highly specialized. You need like expensive people to work on that stuff. And so at some point he tasked one of his teams, who were all sort of back end guys, or to the extent that they had done front end stuff, it was like with Windows Presentation Foundation and .NET and things
One.
like that. And he said, find out what it's like to build user interfaces for the web platform. And they went off and toiled for quite a long time and came back and showed him, and he was like, "You've got to be kidding! Like, it can't be that hard." We were doing this much more easily 30 years ago. He tasked one of the teams with coming up with a thing that just makes it easier to do what we used to do, which is have some components, wire them together, get a useful piece of software, go home, go to the pub. That's where it comes from. And then XML is almost the least important aspect of it in a way. I mean, it's just the
Right.
representation of this. So it's declarative. It's a declarative way of describing applications.
Right. Right.
And we use XML. I mean, it could have been JSON, it could have been YAML. Almost that part doesn't matter so much. What matters is that you are elevating the semantic level at which you are describing what the application does, so that you can express it in orders of magnitude fewer lines of code.
You're
That's
right.
really it.
Yeah. 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 Intriguing. I really must go and take a closer look. But yeah, I remember the days of the marketplace for VBXs, isn't that what they were called in
And
the
OCXs, yeah,
OCXs? Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, I remember being pleasantly surprised how quick, as long as I was, to your earlier point, as long as I was on a well-worn path, as long as I was trying to do something that was going to be, you know, where I had a fighting chance of being able to find an existing OCX or whatever, that did it. It was really quite simple back in the day to pull together, useful little applications with that.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's stuff that we continue to come across, would you believe, today even, um, in some of the industries that we work in that are very, very, very slow to move, very, very conservative. we find very old versions of Windows, and we find VBA and code on life support and so on. So it's still out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it still works, it's not going to be that easy to recreate that thing.
No, indeed. No,
Although I hope it will become easier to recreate that thing.
indeed. Yeah, me too. Me too. Well, John, we've been talking here for over an hour, and it's been absolutely fascinating to walk down memory lane with you and talk about all of these different things. I greatly appreciate the time that you've given me today, and hopefully we will talk again sometime here soon. So thank you
It's
very much.
been a great pleasure. Thank you, John.